Hi, this is your host Apni Bhartiya and welcome to FR Talk. Today we have with us once again Nikita Shamgunov, CEO and founder of Neon. Nikita, it's great to have you on the show again.
Excited to be here.
And one of the biggest things that we are going to discuss today is 25 million investment into Neon. But before we talk about all those things, let's do some basics. We have, of course, hosted you before, so our audience they do know about Neon, but it's a great idea to just refresh their memories. So talk a bit about what is Neon.
Thank you for having me. Neon is serverless Postgres. Postgres is the most popular database amongst developers these days. It is a 30-year-old project, but the dynamics of its consumption are such that it's becoming very, very similar to that of Linux, what Linux had become for operating systems. So Postgres has become the standard operational relational database that almost every developer knows about and then also knows how to use. What Neon is doing is building the bar none best cloud service for Postgres. And the key feature of Neon is the fact that it's serverless. What serverless means that you never need to choose a size of your Postgres database, and database becomes kind of just a URL. So now when people build applications, they think about all the services that are out there on the internet. It could be Stripe for payments, it could be Vercel for front end, it could be Resend for sending emails. Yet databases are not quite at the same level of consumption. They're more perceived as infrastructure rather than a service or like a developer service, where it's just a simple API to interact with the database. And then from that point on, it's trivial. You never have to think about any scalability limits, any management and whatnot. So that's what we're doing. We're taking Postgres, and we're taking Postgres because it's the most popular database amongst developers as of 2024 Stack Overflow survey, turning the consumption into just a URL type consumptions as like any modern service on the internet, and then taking it even a step further and building more of a developer platform around Postgres rather than just an infrastructure service.
Can you talk about what is driving this popularity of Postgres?
Yeah, I've been thinking that, and as I was running my previous company, Single Store, that's now north of 100 million run rate, I noticed that Postgres was everywhere, and I was like, why? I think the answer is in the specifics of how this technology was conceived and developed, and certain decisions that were made, 20, 30 years ago are playing out. The first thing to understand is that database development is, call it battles underwater in slow motion. And the reason to that is that there is an immense amount of reliability requirements for database infrastructure, and the surface area is very, very large, right? Because every database is not only storage, it's also kind of like high availability, reliability services, which means replication, recovery, things of that nature, and then a full language. So SQL is a language on in itself, but then usually there's a stored procedure language. So that contributes to the surface area, and then there's like plugins. With all that said, the other key decision that you can make is, does a company develop our technology or the world? So, and finally, what is the open source license attached to this technology? So I think the thing that over many, many years, over decades now, contributed to the popularity of Postgres are super permissive license. So the license for Postgres is called the Postgres license. It was the most permissive license compared to that of MIT and Apache 2.0. The second thing is that Postgres is built to standards. There's a standard in relational databases called ANSI, and Postgres has been religious in following that standard. Now, as an example, MySQL wasn't as religious following that standard. and it has a less permissive license, GPL license. So, and then for a long period of time, MySQL was more popular than Postgres because MySQL had more features and it was easier to use with developers. But in the long run, those things started to slow down MySQL development. Then Oracle acquired MySQL, and the rate of innovation slowed down as well. And Postgres just kind of like kept going on. It almost like a Lindy principle, like the longer you live, the more likely you're permanent. So license, contributed a good deal of popularity into Postgres because, well, you don't have to think about any legalities when you adopt Postgres, right? It's super permissive license. The other thing is, ANSI standards made it a lot easier to migrate Oracle to Postgres. And of course, you do want to migrate workloads from Oracle to Postgres, especially commodity workloads, right? When Oracle runs something extremely mission critical, that's not something people consider as an easy migration from Oracle to Postgres. But then there's a ton of small apps that are kind of silly to pay Oracle to run those apps when you can trivially run them on Postgres. And the fact that Postgres has a standard reach surface area built according to ANSI standard made all of that much easier. So that's another contributor to the popularity. Finally, the plugins, I think, are just brilliant. And when people use Postgres, many of them keep asking a question, wait, hey, do you support geospatial? And of course, there's a plugin in Postgres called PostGIS. Or do you support, most recently, vector database? Well, there's a plugin called PG Vector. And seemingly for any more niche workload, like time series, there's timescale plugin. For every niche workload that is not quite as general purpose as the OLTP online transactional processing, there is a plugin for Postgres that delivers on this niche workload. And over time, that created an ecosystem and allowed people to even publish those memes, where the classic bell curve meme, where in the beginning of the bell curve, a person with 80 IQ says just use Postgres. Then in the middle of the bell curve, all these other tools, but 140 plus IQ, just use Postgres. So all of those things are kind of very foundational, and they don't drive results overnight, but they certainly do drive that adoption over a very, very long period of time. So people trust this technology, which in operational relational database space is extremely important.
As you were earlier saying, that it also really matters whether a piece of code or software is created by a company or the rest of the world. How important is open source for you? And when I look at open source, I don't really look at code, because code is actually very easy. The most challenging thing is collaborate, build a community around it. So talk a bit about the importance of open source for Neon. How do you folks look at it?
Right. So this was a very interesting, it's a very good question, first of all. And we thought through quite deeply about everything that Neon does is open source. And Neon innovation happens inside of the Postgres engine itself, then outside of Postgres engine in extensions, and then the majority of innovation is happening in the Neon storage project, which is a separate project and not part of the Postgres code base. That's new, that's written in Rust, plus in our cloud service. So there's a lot to cover. The first thing to understand is that Postgres is such an established project that it runs on a yearly cadence. And then there's this thing called Commit Fest, where the whole world proposes changes into Postgres in the form of commits. Those are discussed by the committers, and the committers the important part is that the committers of Postgres, and those are the people who are deciding what goes in and what's not, are not consolidated in a single company, right? Neon has committers. Is in fact one of the co-founders of Neon, Heikki Leena-Kangas, is a Postgres committer. There's a number of committers at Amazon. There's a number of committers at Microsoft. There's a number of committers at Enterprise DB and Crunchy Data. So committers are spread around the industry. And I believe that it is part of the rules of engagement that no company will ever be able to consolidate committers. So that is impossible, because that's kind of structural to how Postgres community is run, the development of Postgres. So the key innovation of Neon, and that's what allows Neon to be serverless, is separation of storage and compute. And when you say separation of storage and compute, that just means that you need to build your own storage. And Neon storage is built from ground up, built from scratch. It's written in Rust. It has the Apache 2.0 license, and we deploy that storage every day, right? So Neon runs a cloud service. We deploy the storage every day. We make changes in that storage every day. And that's what really allows us to innovate at a much faster cycle speed than yearly releases of Postgres, right? So while we're fully dependent on the Postgres project, because we're a Postgres company, we contribute to Postgres engine. Recently, Postgres 17. It's not shipped yet, but it's about to be shipped. And there's a number of contributions from Neon employees there. But the overall Neon stack, we're shipping software every day. And that's happening mostly outside of the Postgres engine. Now, how important it is for us to be open source is a great question. I think the number one strategic importance is that the world understands the advantages of this architecture, right? And the outside of Neon, the most popular product that has this architecture is AWS Aurora, right? They pioneered separation of storage and compute for operational databases in the cloud. They first did it from MySQL and then later for Postgres. Us being open source allows us to establish an open source alternative and kind of claim that open source real estate, claim this open source swim lane here. Us having this, for somebody else who comes later and then says, okay, I'm going to build an open source Aurora, it's going to be a lot harder for them to do, because why not just take Neon? And Neon is already there, and it's moving really fast, and it has an open license. So why don't you just take that code and build on top of it? Finally, of course, Neon is very, very well built, by incredible engineers. And now has a 3-year head start for anybody comes next in the open source world. So from that standpoint, super important for us to be open source. All our revenue is in the cloud. So we have no aspirations, at least no aspirations so far, to monetize on-prem deployments. And that's why for all the partners out there, for all the people who are interested in on-prem, go ahead, knock yourself out, take our code, and deploy it at any scale anywhere.
And as you are talking about, that Neon, you folks have been around for a while, and you also mentioned, AWS Aurora. Talk a bit about what gives Neon an edge over AWS's Postgres offering. Why organizations or the user base leans towards it, and then we'll also talk about the Microsoft's investment through M12.
It's an excellent question, and it's something that I also thought quite deeply about. There are advantages that exist today, and some of them are structural, as in it's going to be very, very hard for Amazon to copy them. And then some of them are not structural, It's just something that we have that is useful, and that's a feature. And of course, Amazon can build that feature. In fact, some of those features they're launching on the upcoming reInvent. So let's talk about them. Obviously, the most structural advantage is that the fact that we can go multi-cloud. Today, we are on Amazon and Amazon only, but this fall, we're launching a set of Azure services. And certainly the fact that Microsoft invested in us is not a coincidence. The world is kind of split between hyperscalers with a certain amount of share, and very large companies are usually consumers of at least 2 cloud services, or maybe all 3. And then for those companies, it's super convenient if a particular service is uniform across every cloud. Now, there's also a lot of companies that are Microsoft shops. They are fully on Azure, fully committed on Azure, and Azure currently has a gap. It does not have a competing service with AWS Aurora. This gap is not forever, obviously, right? So everything that's worth building will be built. But I think we have a window where we can have a very, very compelling offering in the Azure universe that is on par or better than AWS Aurora. So that multi-cloud advantage is structural. The second structural advantage is the way Neon builds the platform is more of a developer platform rather than an infrastructure platform. But what is the difference? I'll give you a few examples. So, AWS Aurora or Azure Flexible Server for Postgres are infrastructure offerings. You need to go to the Azure console or AWS console, dig through, find this thing, stand it up, and then start using. An example of a developer platform is something like GitHub. So GitHub is a developer platform. The litmus test for it is, are developers in your company have direct access to this platform and are totally okay with standing up services on that platform? Or you have an SRE team or DevOps team that sits in between and kind of constrains direct consumption of that platform. So for Aurora, becoming a developer platform is quite tricky, right? Because they have to be a part of the broader offering of AWS. And the way you are present in AWS is prescribed for you for every service from 100 plus services on AWS. And we have an opportunity to build something like GitHub where developers have direct access to it. And of course it's possible because we're serverless. So you don't have the ability to turn infrastructure on, forget to turn it off, and rack up the spend. There are other advantages for Neon, and an example of the one that will be kind of resolved by Amazon is the ability for Neon to scale to 0. When people use a lot of Postgres and they allow end users of developers, kind of like end users of Postgres in the org, just to go hog wild and spin up as many Postgres instances as possible. It's super important to be able to scale to 0, because otherwise your spend will run away. If every developer has a developer environment and that developer environment is always on, and you have 1,000 people on your development team, suddenly you have 1,000 instances of Postgres out there just burning spend. What we hear is non-prod environments often contribute to 2/3 of the spend in larger companies. The fact that Neon scales to 0 allows you to kind of not worry about it and give every developer a dev environment with a full Postgres instance, and even with the data that represents the production data. Now, that will be resolved by Amazon, and this reInvent, I'm 90% sure Amazon will announce scale to 0 for AWS Aurora. So that's an example of a feature that is an advantage today that brings real savings for our users, and something that Amazon can also build, and they will. So I know this for a fact. But when you put kind of the lens of what's a developer platform versus the infrastructure platform, you start recognizing things that, wow, for infrastructure platform, you stand it up and you do all these other things to make it ready for developer consumption. And we kind of bundle all those things into the Neon offering. So for example, when you stand up Neon, there's instantly an HTTP API endpoint for interacting with Neon and sending REST API calls into Neon. With Amazon, you have to go and set those things up, build third-party services potentially to make it up and running. When you want to build auth, and every application needs auth, that's like a trip. When you use an infrastructure offering like Amazon, and with Neon is just basically a few clicks, everything's reflected in code and can be deployed in Neon. When you're using modern developer platforms like Vercel, and Vercel has this thing called Vercel previews, then Neon allows you to create a separate database preview for every preview of Vercel. So that's, again, a feature of a developer platform rather than an infrastructure platform. And so that list goes on. When you build for the end user who is a developer versus an end user that is an SRE or DevOps, then things, despite the fact that at the foundational level they're doing roughly the same thing, they're providing Postgres as a service, start to really diverge. And the end state is very similar to that of like GitHub versus just Git as a service. And GitHub is so much more than just Git provided as a service.
Excellent. Once again, thank you. Now, can you talk about this investment and why Microsoft is interested, and how are you going to use this investment? What are the areas where you are planning to grow?
The first and foremost thing is, of course, Azure, right? So we're gonna treat our Azure project as a tier 1 project, as the highest priority project inside the company. Either absolute highest or the same priority as some of the other tier 1 projects. And we will launch Azure pronto. This is happening very, very soon, and our best people are working on launching Azure. The second thing is, of course, launching Azure and having a very, very competitive service compared to Aurora. Those are two different things. So not only we're funding the launch, we're funding the roadmap, we're funding ongoing development in that direction. The second thing is all the go-to-market investments that happen, and they're happening both on the marketing, from the marketing standpoint, and from the sales standpoint, and from the integration standpoint. So obviously, Azure has a number of services that fit Neon kind of like a glove, and all the things that an example would be Azure Functions, right? And Azure Functions is a competitive offering to that of AWS Lambda. So Azure Functions naturally is serverless, and the consumption from a serverless runtime to a serverless database should be made possible, trivial, and just fits on each other like a glove. Similarly, there's a project on Azure called App Builder, and think about it, it's kind of like Heroku, right, but on Azure. And again, it's super important to have a push button, trivial to stand up database on something like the App Builder. It just makes sense. So So we're making kind of integration work with a number of Azure services. We're making technology work by running the core service in Azure very well. We're putting work in marketing, and we'll be co-marketing this service with Microsoft. And then eventually we'll run sales engagements as well.
When it comes to databases, of course, Oracle, they are one of the biggest player as well. But because some of their business practices, organizations, even governments, they are looking at alternatives at times. What role is Neon playing in helping those folks migrate away?
I think that there are industry trends, and Neon directly is contributed somewhat, but the bigger industry trends are the ones that are creating sea change. And the sea change is that new workloads go on Postgres. And that is a fact, Neon, with Neon, or without Neon. And if you take the Stack Overflow survey of 24 and compare it with 23, it was already obvious in 23 that Postgres is the best database for new applications, and especially in professional developers, and that trend is only stronger in 24. So I think Postgres is, overall a big threat to Oracle. Now, what Neon is basically doing is it's capturing the developers' mindshare, right? And Neon is making the consumption of Postgres simpler than the consumption of Postgres as open source technology, or the consumption of Postgres on AWS. So that's what makes Postgres so important. And then finally, it's like the ecosystem. What you see is the ecosystem that's developing around both Postgres and Neon. Our serverless driver, for example, is downloaded 160,000 times a week. And that's like Neon related, right? It's not related to, that's not just for Postgres, it's only for Neon. And so, we can see that adjacent services like authentication, like ORMs, like all of them starting to pay very, very close attention to what Neon is doing. And it's a very symbiotic relationship where we're making all those next generation developer platforms to be integrated together and trivially consumed. Everything's open source, and that's creates a lot of trust in the developer ecosystem as well. So I think it's just like that developer sentiment is shifting. Postgres keeps growing, and that should be, and that's what's threatening Oracle's position, not necessarily like Neon going direct against Oracle.
Nikita, thank you so much for joining me today, and not only talk about where Postgres market is, but also how Neon is kind of invested in that, and now Microsoft is also joining the community to help developers. Thanks for those great insights, and I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you.
Thank you. Excited to be here.